Welcome, everybody, to today's conversation about the intersects of peacebuilding and LGBTQ activism. Today, we are going to, as peace builders, take a step back and have an honest and authentic conversation about some of the most complex experiences of conflict. My name is Mena Ayazi with Search for Common Ground, and we are the largest dedicated peacebuilding organization in the world with over 1,000 staff across 32 countries. Our mission is to change the way the world deals with conflict, moving away from destruction and towards collaboration. To learn more about us and get involved in our work, you can visit sfcg.org. The link will also appear in the chat in a moment. You can follow today's conversation by using the hashtags #InclusivePeace and hashtag Pride and Peace, and tag @SFCG_ on Twitter, as well as the speakers, and all of our handles which will show up in the chat in a moment. So as I said, today's discussion topic is going to be about the intersections of peacebuilding and LGBTQ activism. Usually when we as a community talk about inclusive peace, the thoughts and perspectives of the LGBTQ+ community are excluded and overlooked, especially when gender is in the conversation. Further, if peacebuilding's goal is to create a safe and inclusive world for all, then we should acknowledge that that world is not necessarily a present reality for LGBTQ peacebuilders who usually face increased threats and violence because of their identities. As an effort to streamline, socialize, and uplift the community and unpack the real intersectionalities of inclusivity, we've brought together prominent activists within the peacebuilding space who have been working to bring awareness to LGBTQ issues and integrate them in peacebuilding work. We're going to hear from 3 LGBTQ+ activists today who will share their experiences and thoughts. We're joined first by Chitra Nagarajan, a journalist and activist, Basel Dakak, a Syrian refugee, and also an LGBTQ activist who works with Search's Lebanon office, and Dumiso Gatsha, who is a young LGBTQ peace builder and founder of Success Capital in Botswana. Dumi's calling from Botswana, Chitra from Nigeria, Basel from Lebanon, and I myself am in Denver. I'm so thrilled to have the 3 of you here today. Welcome. Okay, we're going to jump right into the conversation. And as we talk about the intersections of LGBT activism and the experiences of LGBTQ folk, we cannot ignore the fact that these experiences are very unique and very individual. So I'd love to start off by asking, I'll start off with Basel here. Basel, how did you get involved in LGBTQ activism? What is it that really pushed you to adopt this agenda as something you wanted to work on?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for allowing me to be a part of this. I'm very excited to be with all of you. Well, first I moved to Lebanon in 2011. I used to live in Syria. I'm originally Syrian, and I had my eyes on the future as a young individual. I did not really understand the gravity of the LGBTQI community situation in the Mena region, and in Lebanon specifically. But later on in 2012, I started getting involved with small civil society initiatives that were implemented in Lebanon, directed towards the LGBT community. The initiatives provided services such as capacity building sessions, community mobilization, and a lot more. And these past experiences had really armed me with adequate knowledge and understanding of the legal context of the LGBTQI community in Lebanon. And in the Mena region, of course. A lot had been done back then, but I always believed that there is a lot more that needed to be done. And that is to elevate the quality of our lives as the LGBT individuals and the security of the Lebanese LGBT community. Back then, a larger number in 2013, 2014, larger number of Syrian refugees started coming into the country, into Lebanon, due to the Syrian war escalation that increased in magnitude and brutality. So I started meeting these LGBT individuals, refugees, who had fled their countries, who have fled their homes due to war, discrimination, persecution, and pursue for a better and safer life. It was no secret back then that the Lebanese government strategies to contain the refugee situation in Lebanon were not effective, neither inclusive to such key populations, discriminated against and persecuted on a daily basis due to their sexual orientation and gender identity. It failed to address the needs of these key population and ended by the Lebanese government suspending the registration of these refugees in May 2015, which later really complicated the situation of these LGBT refugees with regards to providing medical, social services by the government, and forbid them from obtaining refugee status in the country, which has a lot more complications to their social status here. This is when I joined the movement seriously, because I felt that there is a need, and which had to be filled. There is a huge void which had to be filled, especially when the government is absent in these situations. And we needed to set in place adequate and effective services provided to these population and advocate through various programs and projects for equity, justice to those who left their homes in pursuit of a better life. All I needed when I first came to Lebanon was a small nudge or a safe platform like the one we have right now together, where I can learn, process my experiences, my past experiences in war, and implement and express who I am as an individual. All I needed is this small nudge towards a long journey of fighting for a better representation of the LGBTQI community in the MENA region, for justice, for equity, and for security. I had no doubt there were hundreds of thousands like me in Lebanon, in Syria, and in the MENA region, and even around the world. People who wanted to learn more and be an active member of a society that respects freedom of expression, that protects those who are marginalized due to their status, sexual orientation, or gender identity. And this nudge is what got me to be the activist that I am today. This is what to go into the field, because I believe that it's time to realize our full potential, because these activists, we are all born with it. And it's that knowledge, it's that adequate knowledge to employ our efforts in realizing the full joint potential as an international community when advocating for LGBT issues in the MENA region.
Thank you for sharing, Basel. And that's a very interesting journey. And it's also very interesting to see how you yourself were going through transition and you found out that there was so much more complexity behind this idea of migration and displacement and the violence that people face. So very cool to see your journey and how you got into this work. Chitra, I'd love to turn it over to you and ask you, because I think you've had somewhat of a similar yet different journey than Basel. And so we'd love to hear, how did you get involved in LGBT activism?
Great, thank you, Mena, and hello, everybody. It's great to be online. I'm particularly excited to see so many people from Northeast Nigeria, Cameroon, and the Lake Chad region in particular. It's really nice to see people from the region on this call. I think for me, I've always been an LGBTQI activist for a very long time. It was part of my intersectional feminism, but for a long time, I saw my activist world doing feminist, anti-racist, anti-fundamentalist, LGBTQI activism was separate from my work world, which was conflict analysis, peace building, and maybe we can talk a little bit more about that later on and why peace building doesn't allow space for these conversations. But for me, I really felt that peace building was not a field where you could have these discussions about LGBTQI rights. And so for a very long time, I did these two things separately in parallel. So I was doing my peace building work in Northern Nigeria, and then also working with and for LGBTQI organizations, groups, working with activists to do work in Nigeria at the same time. But the two actually didn't really come together. And I would say even now, it's still a struggle to get peace builders interested in LGBTQI activism and taking the rights of people of sexual orientations, gender identities, and gender expressions considered to be non-normative or deviant seriously, and integrating safety and security for all people into their vision of what peace means.
That's so powerful. Thank you for sharing, Chitra. And you said something that really struck me, which is kind of the point of why we're here, is that you were doing all of this work, yet you saw that intersect in all of your work. And so for you, it wasn't necessarily like this different world that you jumped into, but you saw it being an integral part of, you know, the work you're doing with feminism and anti-racist work and the peace building and conflict resolution work. And I think that's a very, very powerful distinction and point to make. Dumi, I would love to turn it to you now. Not only do you work directly with queer youth, but you yourself are a member of the community. So I'd also love to ask you, what is that like, carrying this identity and doing this work that can be so dangerous? So we'd love to hear from you.
Thanks so much, Mena. I think it's really quite important to mention that, you know, it's so difficult to sit and separate your identities. So as an individual born in Zimbabwe, I am a migrant, having spent almost a decade in South Africa, you know, and having experienced so many different variances about different issues about in society. And I think recognizing that whenever, for instance, you know, in the public health response, speaking to key populations, you know, in the HIV response, you then realize very quickly that some solutions are quite linear, and then you get to the point, you know, where there's discourse around strategic litigation in asserting human rights of those who are obviously marginalized and excluded, and you then realize that's only another element, and that, you know, as a community, in our holistic selves, there's so many other elements that are often ignored as a result of the development praxis, as a result of humanitarian frameworks. And similarly, you know, we don't find it possible to queer up spaces for advocacy, or even when you speak about nuclear disarmament. But we know, we recognize this within the context of intersectionality, that they're all connected, and coming from a region where there is shared historical colonial history in terms of struggle, in terms of, you know, ideological building around Pan-African ideals, and recognizing that there's been a lot of critical work that hasn't been, you know, recognized as a gendered form of activism, that hasn't been named or labeled as feminism. And I think for me, you know, where this really comes from is from recognizing that as a result of living some of these experiences, and as a result in some, you know, instances of not knowing that this is not right and that this is not okay, you know, I think that's how I found myself in the context of activism, you know, built in the context of, okay, now I need to get a job and make sure I meet different expectations. And then I must just find myself in this environment that isn't inclusive. You know, when someone reads the Bible at me, and I'm working for a multilateral development organization at the age of 22, what should that then mean? What should that then reflect like? So it's not just systemic, but it's inherent in harmful gender norms, in the palatability of what professionalism looks like. And so that's what we get to see, you know, as a virtue of my identity, there's certain things that would occur and that would happen that aren't so easily, I guess, legally or even written on paper that this is discrimination or that this is unjust. And the reality is that, unfortunately, I now bear the burden of having to try and correct that environment, of having to try and call out at risk of, you know, reprisals, at risk of not being invited to certain decision-making tables, or at risk of, you know, being considered too difficult or too angry. And so I think, you know, there's so many nuances and complexities, but we can't speak about it without recognizing colonial history, historical injustices of race supremacy, and recognizing that there's a gendered lens to it that has often been ignored and only coming up now as a result of Beijing +25, generation equality, and so forth. So I think it's really quite critical for us to acknowledge and recognize that identity, as a result of some of these vulnerabilities, or as a result of recognizing that we can't leave a certain aspect of ourselves behind. And so I think for me, that's where really, in terms of, you know, advocacy or engaging or challenging whatever space or sphere of influence I found myself in, that's really what it meant. You know, speaking truth to power, being my true self, even in the context of the home environment. And I'm super glad that, you know, and this isn't common, that my dad is even on this call. So that's really fantastic.
That was very powerful. Thank you for sharing, Dumi, and welcome Dumi's father. We're really happy to have you join us today. And Dumi, you said something that was really powerful there, in that your lived experiences as a queer peace builder and the activism that you do are not separate. You live it day to day in your life. And it's posed a number of challenges, yet has empowered you in a way that has really given you this bold platform to be your authentic self. And that's very, very powerful. So thank you for sharing that with us. And I would love to unpack a little bit more about what you said around gender theory and queer theory as we go on in the conversation. Now, all three of you have touched upon some of the intersects between peace building and LGBT activism, and really boldly pointed out that the intersects are everywhere. It's in everything that we do. When we talk about anti-colonial work and we talk about racism, we talk about mediation, dialogue, negotiation, all of this work that we do. So Chitra, I'd love to turn a question to you. You recently worked on a report that's to be released soon that explored the experiences of the LGBTQ community in Nigeria. What were some challenges and opportunities that came out of this research? And what was it like to be working with queer peace builders in this field, especially in a research project that big?
Thank you very much, Mena. So the research study that you refer to was done for the Initiative for Equal Rights, which is an LGBTQI human rights organization based in Lagos. And the aim of the research was really to find out the experiences of queer people living through the conflict in Northeast Nigeria. And for me, you know, I was born in my degree in Northeast Nigeria. I have lived here, I've done peacebuilding work in Northeast Nigeria since 2013. But doing this study was like kind of suddenly putting on glasses, or things that were there before and that, you know, you would hear hints of before, suddenly came into sharp focus. And it just really overlaid so many of the conflict dynamics that I was already aware of, that I've already done research on. But because we didn't look specifically at the experiences of LGBTQI people for valid reasons to do with safety, security, and other factors, they weren't clear. And it was really surprising to me, like how much there is there. And I just want to talk about 3 points here. The first is that the experiences of many of the LGBTQI people with whom I spoke to, they're very similar to any other conflict affected people. So they experience many of the same risks. They evidence many of the same strategies towards escaping violence, looking after themselves, looking after their families. But there was an additional layer there. And I want to, if I may, illustrate this by telling a story of a young man who is currently in IDP camp somewhere in Northeast Nigeria. And I think you'll understand if I don't reveal his location. He was a young man when armed opposition groups, commonly known as Boko Haram, attacked his village. He was part of a group of young men who were playing football at the time. And because young men were often targeted and killed by the group, he and his friends escaped and they fled to a nearby town. In that town, they were waiting anxiously for news of their families. Unfortunately, he found out that his father had been killed, that they had come inside his home and basically told the father that they were going to kill him. At which point his father said, okay, that's fine, but let me just pray before you kill me. And after the father did his final prayer, he was killed in front of his wife, Idris's mother. Then, as soon as his mother told him the story, she collapsed. And even though she was hospitalized, she never recovered and she died in hospital. Now, Idris moved from IDP camp to IDP camp to IDP camp until he ended up in the camp where I met him. And there, he started a relationship with his best friend from home. And they were in a very close, loving relationship until one day, the Civilian Joint Task Force, which is a community militia group that was set up to defend communities and work with the military in fighting armed opposition groups, decided that his boyfriend was gay and started insulting him, beating him. One day they beat him so vigorously and severely that they broke his legs. And the extent of the injuries was such that one of his legs had to be amputated and he died in hospital. And Idris was with him the whole time. Now, because he had stayed in hospital, he was then also seen as suspicious and suspected of being gay. And so then the insults, the verbal abuse, the physical abuse came to him. He was not able to go and receive food distribution because the people who were engaged in the violence were there at the food distribution, and he was worried that going there would reveal his sexual orientation to even more people than who currently knew in the IDP camp. The thing that saved him, though, was two of his childhood friends from his village, who, despite all attempts to separate them, so the brother, they were brother and sister. The brother was also started receiving verbal abuse because he had a friend who was suspected of being gay. The sister, her fiance was warned off marrying her. But despite all of these attempts, and despite Idris's own attempts to distance himself from them so as to not cause them issues, they refused to leave his side. And that's the reason why he still continued getting food, because the sister kept bringing him food. And really, they became a family to him after his entire family had been killed. And I say this, I give this story in such great detail because I think for me, it illustrates a few things. Number one, it illustrates that queer people face all the risks that people who are not queer face, but it also illustrates that there's an additional layer of risk as well. So where Idris and his boyfriend faced actually some of the most horrific violence was not due to the armed opposition groups. It wasn't due to soldiers, but it was due to their own community. And it was after they were supposedly in a place that was safe. And that's where kind of the violence and the abuse happened to them. And of course, for women or people who are coded as women, there is an additional layer of violence and realities and persecution based on their gender as well. And the second point that I wanted to make really about the intersections between peacebuilding and LGBTQI issues and also the findings of the report was really about how, to some extent, certain norms of masculinity and also homophobia can drive conflict as well. Back in 2016, I did a research study looking at masculinities, conflict and violence. And there it was really interesting because we were talking to focus groups and we were giving an example of young men who are not able to find employment. And so they help their mothers and sisters doing basically in household businesses or home-based businesses to sell for profit. And by and large, all the people in those focus group discussions started insulting the young man in our hypothetical scenario, calling him Yandaldu, which is basically a community in northern Nigeria of people assigned male gender at birth who act in ways that are seen coded as feminine. And even went to the extent of saying that we understand why he's doing what he's doing. And obviously we don't want people to get involved in gangs and groups that perpetrate violence. But if the man had joined a gang, we would have respected him. So I think that really shows how the threats of being seen as gay or being seen as gender non-conforming can really drive people, or at least be one of the drivers into violence. And the third point that I want to make, and then I will finish, is just really the point that culture is not static and social norms are not static. And what our research found was actually there was a great deal more tolerance and openness in the past, but that over the past few decades, due to a number of factors, including the conflict, the space for queer people has been constricting to the extent that now it is very, very difficult. And the Yandaldu, who I spoke of before, who could previously gather and dress in clothes that are seen to be feminine, that were engaging in businesses that are also seen as feminine, they are not visible anymore. And they're not able to engage in these activities, self-expression and livelihoods that they want to or that they used to, because of the extreme policing and the rise of this discourse of immorality I have lots more to say, but let me stop here because I would love to hear from Dumi and Basel too.
Thank you for sharing that, Chitra. And you talked about some really important things. And I think the most important I heard from that was that the really complex layers that LGBTQ people face within violence, right? Not just from armed forces, but from the communities, from the governments, from state actors, from families. And that's a very, very important distinction. And your story of that young man was really heart-wrenching and powerful, and was a very great description of the very different areas that violence can come from, and the complexity that displacement, for example, also, as Basel mentioned earlier, can play in this experience. Basel, I'd love to turn to you now. As you hear Chitra give this account about the experiences of LGBT people in Nigeria and with displacement specifically, what resonates with you in the Lebanese context? I know Lebanon's been went through a period of violence last year, and is going through very hard economic hardship. So how is that impacting the Lebanese community as well?
Well, it hasn't been really easy. The Lebanese civil society, on refugees, on the LGBTQI community, on the country itself, especially the LGBT people in Lebanon, they face several challenges as it's considered against the law. Article 534 of the Lebanese Penal Code condemns unnatural intercourse between same-sex individuals and prosecutes them up to 3 years in prison. And there is the problem, the open-ended morality laws that can be played in so many ways, so many out of proportion, that can be blown out of proportion. Articles that helps unlawful persecution of LGBT individuals around Lebanon and around the world as well, and feeds the discrimination and stigmatization amongst the public towards this LGBT community, which is what Chitra actually mentioned. We go through a lot of the same challenges here in Lebanon. And it's because of the not only the military, not only positions, not only the governments, but also the community itself. On the other hand, we need to also think about it and add another layer to this question. And we need to think about it in a nuanced way. In general, the poorer you are in Lebanon, the more challenges you face, right? And so on the rest of the world. And thus you have access to less basic services provided by the government. The same applies to LGBT community. The wealthier you are, the more privilege you have. And so it is usually the poorest among us who face much greater challenges. For example, housing, security, job security as well, lack of social safety net, access to medical services, which is very important nowadays, especially in a country where we had an explosion in August 2020, and the medical staff was overloaded because of the corona and the pandemic that's been storming in Lebanon as well. And so it is these services, like such as for these key populations, such as transgender people, for example, transgender individuals. And this is where we come in. This is where the civil society joins forces, talents, and these activists, these individuals, community members, allies, to provide durable solutions for these LGBT. And this is my fight. This is our fight in the Lebanese civil society. How can we include these people? How can we include these key populations? How can we fill the void that the government left? And that has been expanding for decades now, provide these opportunities for those individuals to be meaningfully engaged in the peace-building process, advocating for justice, for security, exerting efforts to reform and to apply reform, to implement serious positive change within our government, to reflect in our community members, because we cannot blame everybody. We cannot blame community members who haven't really seen or acquired the knowledge to accept and understand what's out there, you know? And I also want to mention a small story, which is one of the projects that I'm working with an NGO called the Arab Foundation for Freedom and Equality, where we're actually implementing a project where we're giving the opportunity and the platform to these activists from Syrian refugees, activists, LGBT community, and where I had the privilege of working with these amazing people who came here. They did not really know a lot about the LGBT community. They did not really know that they have the right to express themselves for who they are, for their authentic self. And this is what I always say. When I first came here to Lebanon, I only needed this small nudge that will get me to acquire the knowledge, because we cannot fight a war, but when we have the knowledge, we can finally win that war. And I had the privilege of working with these people, and I saw how important it is for them to acquire this knowledge and how important it is for them to be given the opportunity to influence the civil society. And they did great. With only little money, they were able to actually make a great impact in the Lebanese civil society. And they helped a lot of LGBT individuals, even though we're going through a lot, but these small initiatives that really gives me hope in our region and around the world as well. So I believe about the intersectionality as well. I believe that it is a very important component. I mean, peace building is an organic component of activism. Lobbying and advocating for LGBT causes in the MENA region and around the world involve an inherent component of peace building, such as increasing tolerance in the LGBT communities and the public spheres, and as well due to the existence of many different communities in Lebanon from different backgrounds, whether it was religious, political, social, which requires an intersectional and cross-cutting approach in all our projects and in our approach towards advocating for this key population. Thus, I believe that peace building is a critical tool to help build these bridges between these communities, eliminate any ambiguities, confusion, which might blur our vision as activists. This is what we need to work on. This is actually what we worked on for 14 months with Search for Common Ground. We went through capacity building sessions to understand what conflict means, because we did not know what conflict means. We always say conflict, but we do not know how to deal with conflict, right? We do not know how to implement conflict resolution techniques. And we implemented many activities with different community members in Lebanon to help understand the difference and build a safe platform for discussions and debate, just like you mentioned, And this is when the magic happens. It is when different people from different backgrounds come together to courageously speak of their differences, which has been dividing them as a community. And I believe it's to serve a corrupt agenda of divide and conquer because of our governments and so on. This sooner we talk about and speak up of these differences in an adequate and safe platform, the sooner we understand this fact. And that is what's going to bring us closer. This is when we talk about integrating the LGBT community within the peace building strategies, was one of the most important elements in any project for me, no matter how different the context is, as LGBT communities in the MENA region and around the world will always exert the same effort, if not increasing effort, to have a fair representation and a weight within decision-making and with the thought leaders around the world to positively influence the impact and a positive change and the reforms. I always say reforms because it's very important to start now. It's 2021, and I believe it's enough in the MENA region and around the world to have such open-ended morality, the roles that can be blown way out of proportion, and to protect these rights of those who get prosecuted based on their gender identity and sexual orientation.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for sharing that, Basel, and sharing the context of Lebanon specifically. And I think that legal persecution is not unique to Lebanon either. We just saw Hungary pass an anti-LGBTQ law just last week, and a huge protest happened at the soccer game between Hungary and Germany. And I think that also speaks to the power of collective action that you're talking about, is that when we as a community come together and we partner with our friends in different communities, regardless of our backgrounds, we can really make magic happen. And that progress has been shown throughout human history, even if, as Chitra mentioned, some spaces are getting worse in some cases. I really appreciated your optimism in that answer, Basel, and I hope we can unpack the opportunity side of this a little bit more. But you also talked about intersectionality, which I'd love to turn to Dumi now. Dumi, intersectionality is a very core part of the work that you do with LGBTQ youth. I would love to hear a little bit more about that specific work that you do and how intersectionality has really played a role with young people who not only face this a sexual and gender minority, but also face this age that faces so many different challenges as well.
Thanks so much, Mena. And I think, it's critical, to recognize the importance of language, the importance of understanding different concepts. And I think, when I look back into my younger years in terms of activism, a lot of work that we're doing was considered radical. A lot of work was considered unconventional and obviously not normative. And this is primarily because it was coming from an intersectional praxis. And so recognizing this, I think it's important for us to sort of at least take it back a bit in recognizing that our position speaks to peace, not necessarily as the absence of war, but that it's also recognizing, in the words of Nina Simone and how she described freedom, is having no fear. And so what does that then look like? Not having fear. Fear of, one, being able to pay bills, number two, being able to be accepted in certain spaces, number three, being able to secure justice in an environment where there might be impunity for perpetrators. And I think this is critical and important to recognize in that also the differences in opinion and the conflict in ideologies, they find themselves in the context of racism. They find themselves in the context of anti-gendered efforts that try erase, gender beyond binaries. And I think it's important, even when we're speaking about solidarity, and in linking these together, in essence, saying that peace is not the absence of war, but also recognizing that it's a central element to it is not being afraid of freely expressing yourself. And so what does that then look like in the context of programming or research? And I think, one of the elements that we like speaking to is, for instance, research design, and not just, the whether it's qualitative or quantitative, or whether it's phenomenography or ethnography, but it's really now speaking to what is the audience that you're trying to tap to? Are you looking at it from a perspective of someone who is an enabler and, elitist or English-speaking language? Are you looking at it from an angle that is trying to sell something in the context of individual giving or development needs, essentially taking away the agency and autonomy of the communities that you're serving? And so this is what I think, intersectionality questions. It really asks, who's not in the room, and what are the underlying power dynamics? In as much as you're serving a community, does that mean that you're speaking to victims or survivors? Does that mean that you're tailor-making and accommodating a checkbox exercise to say, yes, you've included trans individuals, but not non-binary? Does that mean that you've limited your, working frameworks to the knowledge curation and ownership that lies in the global north and not the global south? What does that mean in the context of community-based development and recognizing how communities are central to humanitarian responses, but they're central to movement building? And I think it's important to recognize that, you can't speak about freedom, you can't speak about peace without recognizing that there's a need for solidarity. I mean, we learned this, in the colonial era struggles, with the Kwame Nkrumahs and, the recently departed President Kenneth Kaunda. And I think, it's really critical and important for us to draw from this history, because essentially a lot of frameworks that we work within, whether we're speaking to international law, whether we're speaking to special procedures regionally or globally, are anchored or based off of historical conflict. And so if we're not able to draw on previous lessons, if we're not able to recognize intergenerational harm and trauma, and even more importantly, arrest instances where there are triggers of issues that we have survived and might continue having to endure as a result of legal, political, social, or economic perspectives, then it negates the very purpose of intersectionality. It negates the very purpose of what freedom looks like, of what security should look like in an environment that might be considered as a peaceful democracy, but still remains as the 8th most unequal in the world and is the 2nd highest in terms of rape incidents that are reported per capita. And and I can't speak of this without recognizing the injustices that LGBTIQ communities are experiencing in the Kakuma camp, you know, and this is now talking about people on the move. I can't speak about LGBTIQ freedom, peace, and security without recognizing the injustices being meted out currently, where a whole parliament is having an hour-long prayer session that is anti-LGBT in Ghana. How is that even acceptable and palatable for governance mechanisms in the context of Africa's Agenda 2063 or the Sustainable Development Goals? You know, we have a crisis in Uganda that is perpetually re-emerging, or two trans activists, not even activists, two trans individuals who have just been imprisoned for over half a decade in Cameroon. And so I think it's critical for us to be able to flag all these issues and recognize that, you know, peace is really the nexus of climate justice. It's the nexus of reproductive rights, gender equity, and leaving no one behind. And I think this is critical for us to continue questioning who's not in the room, whose voice isn't being heard, and ultimately, who are we sitting there and saying that we are ultimately working ourselves out of? Because I think that's the purpose of intersectionality, that we don't need the humanitarian sector. We don't need the development practice or praxis anymore. And so these are critical things that I think essentially we're not allowing ourselves time to sort of question. And I think similarly, we're not allowing, you know, the very communities that we're serving, you know, the rest, you know, not having to do the critical work of calling out, not having the to do the critical work of performative storytelling in instances of trying to secure resources, or in instances of trying to get, you know, programming to come to their community. So I think it's very critical for us to recognize that, you know, the linear neoliberal sort of ways of working are no longer enough, because they don't recognize and affirm the survivors. They don't recognize and empower in a means that doesn't mean that they continue to depend, but in a means that, you know, secures and ensures autonomy, that ensures that, you know, I can fail forward and I can make mistakes in a way that I won't be judged and I don't have to pay, you know, significant prices for, and that ultimately that I can thrive in participating economically, socially, or even in conflict resolution processes.
Yeah, snaps to that, Dumi. When you speak, I just feel the passion and the power through the screen. And I think that that power comes because you have so much courage, and that courage comes because of all the work that you've done within yourself, and because of all of the experiences you've had navigating these really difficult challenges that come into play as a queer peace builder, but also just as an individual navigating very, very, very strict structures and systems that have been created to work against people within the LGBT community and people of different intersectional identities, with both Chitra and Basel talked about as well. I have one more question for the three of you, but I also want to flag that we'll be jumping into live audience Q&A in about a few minutes. So if anybody has questions for any of the panelists, please type them into the chat and we'll try to get to them. We may not get to all of them, but we'll try our best. My last question for the three of you is, we've talked about the challenges, we've talked about the barriers, and we've talked about the intersects. Now, what are some concrete opportunities out there for peacebuilding NGOs, nonprofits, organizations, and activists around the world to truly include LGBTQ perspectives and issues in programming? What can a big organization like Search for Common Ground, for example, do to better include LGBT individuals? Dumi, I'm going to start with you, and then I'll go to Chitra and end with Basel.
Thanks. You know, I think the first thing, you know we always have advisory committees and we have, like, you know, board membership, and that plays a role in terms of representation. But I think time and time again, we've seen that representation isn't always equitable, and it isn't always meaningful in terms of impact, and that it can really be performative, especially around some of the, you know, issues that have been discussed around Black Lives Matter, Me Too, and Charity So White. And so I think it's critical for us to recognize that there is a need to employ and ensure that you engage LGBTIQ individuals, especially where there are multiple vulnerabilities, because you're attaching resources to it and you're being very intentional in ensuring that there's an occupying of space. And I think this is important, not just, you know, in employing LGBTIQ people in LGBTIQ programming or diversity and inclusion roles, but recognizing, you know, how important that those perspectives are in the context of M&E, in the context of, you know, yes, leadership roles, but also in, you know, the deployment of resources resources. Secondly, I think, accountability is so important. And I think even though the onus of accountability always rests with the affected, where we have to actually, prepare shadow reports and, report to law enforcement and follow up on different processes, I think, there's a different form of accountability that is needed, in that how do we meaningfully address historical injustices? How do we meaningfully eliminate barriers to participation in the context of eligibility, language, or ableist policies and framing? And I think, lastly, it's really then adopting intersectionality. Feminist principles really ensure that no one is left behind. They integrate all these different issues, and they allow for working beyond the limitations that come with, for instance, a year-long M&E indicator framework. They really help an individual sort of question, how better can we do this work? And how do we create that space that allows for comfortable challenging, that allows for that level of sort of continuously critiquing and improving to serve communities in a way that, that can be not just impactful in the context of working ourselves out. And so I think it's really about not looking for the low-hanging fruit. It's about doing the difficult work, doing the critical work, and more importantly, not necessarily, taking up the space, but employing the people who have the solutions to it, and recognizing that lived experiences is the form of expertise, and that if there are multiple vulnerabilities, they can equally be multiple strengths and forms of expertise that can come from that individual.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely great points there, Dumi, especially on moving beyond tokenization into meaningful integration. Chitra, over to you to answer the same question. What are some opportunities for our field?
Fantastic. Well, let me start by acknowledging the difficulties. And, as someone who's done peacebuilding for over a decade, I really see why peacebuilders don't do this work, that they don't integrate issues of sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression into their work. They are worried about the reactions of the government, of religious leaders, community leaders, and communities themselves, how it affects the rest of their peacebuilding work. Sometimes it's difficult to know what to do, which would be positive and contribute, as opposed to forming part of the problem. I think especially for peacebuilding organizations that are international, there's a risk of playing into this narrative around LGBTQI rights being westernized, an imposition, part of the process of like an ongoing colonization of sexuality. And also, and I'm sorry to say this, but I think a lot of peacebuilders just don't see this as important, the same way that a lot of peacebuilders don't see gender as important. And I've had people say to me, okay, I'm not saying that you're not raising important issues, but this is really not a priority for us, because our priority is, if it's humanitarians, our priority is getting the food out there, or if it's peacebuilders, our priority is trying to improve community relations. And if we raise these issues, we stop working in the community, and also we inflame tensions and make matters worse. Saying that, however, I would say that just because something is difficult is not a reason not to do it, because if that stopped us, we wouldn't be doing peacebuilding in the first place. And I would say, broadly speaking, there are 3 things that peacebuilders and peacebuilding organizations need to do. The first is really see how to integrate issues of sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression into our analysis, whether that's conflict analysis or protectionist analysis, or for the humanitarians, WASH or food security or livelihoods or whatever you're doing. Because if we don't know what is happening, we can't design interventions. So I would say integrate it for peacebuilding, integrate this into conflict analysis, and integrate it both in terms of the differential impacts of conflict on queer people, the roles that queer people play in either driving conflict or driving peace, and also, how ideas of homophobia, transphobia, heteronormativity drive conflict. And then as part of that, do a risk analysis of what it means to integrate this into your peacebuilding work and map the entry points. Even in what seem as the most closed societies, there are entry points. And if you're strategic, there is work that you can do. The second thing that I would say is support conflict-affected people who are LGBTQI themselves. In some contexts, there may not be formal groups or organizations, but there are always informal groupings. And so really it's reaching out to them, finding out both what their realities and problems are, but also what they want to do, and whether that's coming together, organizing, raising awareness of human rights, building some solidarity amongst each other, and then engaging in influencing and advocacy to humanitarian organizations, peace-building organizations, trying to change conflict narratives. Peace builders really need to take their cue from the people affected, and in this case, LGBTQI people who are conflict affected. And the third thing that I would like to say is I think sometimes people get scared because they think that the option is either do nothing or do everything, right? And neither of them are, for me, a viable strategy, because both of them in some ways risk either causing or perpetuating harm. So I would say start small, based on your conflict analysis, your context analysis, and your risk analysis and entry points. Pilot some things. Start by working with LGBTQI people. Even start by keeping it divorced from all of your other peace building programming and see how that works. And over time, see what is possible, update your risk analysis, because of course, you know, the last thing that we want to do in the name of good intentions is actually cause more harm to the people that we're trying to work with. So those are the 3 points that I would say: analysis, support LGBTQI people, and start small and really see what is possible.
Thank you, Chitra. That was so powerful too. And you said something very bold that we don't talk a lot about, is that people just sometimes don't care about these issues, and homophobia still runs very deep in a lot of the systems that we're working in, even within the international peace building space. So thank you for sharing those 3 main points. Want to turn that into a graphic card that we can just share on social media for all organizations to use. Basel, over to you to close us out on this, and then we'll move into live Q&A.
Well, thank you both for saying what you just said, because it's very empowering, and it's I agree with both of them actually. And the context that we work in the Middle East is a bit dangerous, and I understand why some people might feel worried or afraid for their lives, because we've seen life examples happening in front of us. We've seen friends, even family members, being prosecuted just for advocating for something that is related to LGBT. And it's due to not only the political, but the religious backgrounds, the different religious backgrounds that are really infiltrated within the political structure here in the Middle East, in our governments. And I understand why people are sometimes afraid, but it's dangerous. But it being dangerous, as Chitra said, does not mean that we cannot do it. That's when we take the risk. That's when we do what we do. And that's when I think that togetherness comes in highlight for me. When we're together, we're stronger. I know what I'm saying right now might sound cliche, but what can SFCG do? What can the international community do? We can come together. It's as easy as that. Because, for example, if I am going through something and I tell all my LGBT friends here and family that I'm going through something, with this solidarity, I have less danger to be prosecuted, because now more eyes are on the situation that I'm in. And the exclusion of the LGBTQI community is putting us more at risk, because the prosecution, the discrimination, and everything else that is happening to us, it's far from the public eye. That's why I say solidarity within the international community. The seriousness of the solidarity in the international community can exert the pressure that we terribly need from our governments to change our reforms. That's how we stop corrupted politicians around the world and in the Middle East, to support the establishment of a poor safety net, social safety net, political and economic situations, to step aside and give the opportunity to integrate the LGBT community within the real change into our reforms. I'd also ask the international community to come together, and we can exert this pressure of stop funding these corrupt regimes around the world, that are actively putting LGBT lives and other vulnerable population at risks and threats, discrimination, and sometimes death. It has been always the time to stand hand by hand together as an international community, not only Middle East, not only North Africa, not only North America. No, as an international community, we have one word, we have solidarity, we have a platform where we exert this pressure on our government, because the government is the law, and once the law protects these vulnerable population, we can take legal action against those who try to violate these rights, and actively reflect positive change within our social and political structures. First, I started with a small nudge, as I said before, and now it's the time, I think, for a bigger one that does not divide based on race, color, locality, and so on, but really connects us all as humans and protects us all as human, and specifically as LGBT community.
Absolutely. Also a very powerful answer, Basel. I started listening to the three of you and getting chills and goosebumps because I'm like, yes, yes, yes. That was a very powerful answer. And you're right? Like, we just need to come together. Not us as a community, but our allies especially need to come together and recognize that they have a lot of work to do to support the LGBT community around the world, regardless of where in the world we are, where they are. So moving into Q&A, and unfortunately, because we only have about 5 minutes left, we only have time for one question, but continue to put questions into the chat, and we will try our best to either follow up or answer via social media or something as best we can, or you can get in touch with our panelists through email or social media as well, and we can try to answer your questions. But the question we'll be answering today is from Rashad, who says, I'm wondering your perspectives on the discursive link that is always made between queerness and violence or death. How do we as queer peace builders navigate the middle ground, recognizing the real issues, challenges, and violence we experience while ensuring we are still humanized through our joy, rights, and propensities for peace building? And I'll open the floor to anyone who wanted to answer first.
Maybe I can go there. I think it's often very difficult, especially for individuals. And I know this is something that we've recognized in the context of the public health response, is that, expression can be very dangerous, as is the case even in the most, comprehensively equal country in the context of constitutions and legality in South Africa, where there is a high level of corrective rapes and murders across the queer community. And so I think, we must recognize that safety is important. We need you alive. And I think that's the most important thing. And then secondly, is just recognizing that there might be pockets of acceptability or tolerance. And usually this is sort of attached to urban or elitist spaces. But I think, the integral aspect is just you breathing, because I think that already in itself is really quite critical and important, because wherever you occupy space in a role, you can play a role, and you can comment even if it's, speaking in the third person. And so that's always important and powerful. And, at an institutional level, it's always helpful to be part of networks, because then that's how you sort of raise those voices through those networks that are able to actually essentially, convey your message. And so I think, in an era of social media, in an era of being able to connect in so many different ways, there are different ways that you can, and there isn't one size fits all in the context of activism, but I think primarily safety is important, psychologically, digitally, physically. And I think, in the spirit of solidarity, I like the analogy of, of using the sunlight, sunshine as solidarity, because essentially everyone deserves some sunlight. And so I think, the fact that the sun is there and the fact that you're around an environment that isn't necessarily the most tolerant and that is quite dangerous, it's always critical to recognize that there are voices out there who are allies. And I think LGBTQ communities work in tandem with women's rights movements, and that, we have always found solidarity in worker or labor movements. And so I think it's always critical to sort of reach out and see where are some of those pockets of allies that can be safe, that can allow for you to convey a message, that can allow for you to express yourself even though it's not as you'd want. And I think, in an era of high migration, in an era of being able to explore opportunities, those networks, those movements, platforms such as these, link us to individuals that can help us explore those solutions. So I think, and that's probably my parting shot, solidarity is sunshine and everyone deserves it.
100% Dumi, and sometimes our existence as queer peace builders is enough. Our ability to just be in these spaces and live under that sunshine is enough. Chitra, Basel, if either of you would like to also answer the question.
Yes, thank you. And I really like this question because I think there's this idea, particularly of LGBTQI people in certain countries in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, that queer people's lives are full of pain and suffering, whereas, you know, the West is this utopia of, you know, joy and happiness. And we know that neither of those things are true. So, for example, in Nigeria, we know that queer people in Nigeria do not spend all their time sitting around being vulnerable and victimized. And there's a lot of joy and love and happiness as well. A couple of years ago, I co-edited a book of narratives of Nigerian queer women's lives. And one of the things that me and my co-editors purposefully tried to do was seek out stories of joy and love and connection and support and solidarity, because these are the stories that are not often told, but they're as much a part of people's lives as the victimization and the pain and the suffering. So I think it's really important to remember that. And when we talk about LGBTQI people and peace building, to remember that, you know, if you do peace building work, you are motivated by a positivity, and you're motivated by a sense of love for the world, and a sense of hope for the world. And so why should that be any different when it comes to LGBTQI people?
100% Chitra, 100%. And I think we need to celebrate our community, which is exciting because today's the last day of Pride.